Good afternoon. My name is Paul Rosenbaum. I'm the president of the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, and I was asked to pinch hit in introducing this afternoon's program by Edna Sessian and Francis Levy, who unfortunately were not able to be here today because of other commitments. I've also been asked to remind you that publications by some of the authors on the panel are for sale in the back there, and you can see their books popped up. And I will introduce the moderator for this afternoon's discussion, and he will in turn introduce the other panelists. And he is Craig Piers, P-I-E-R-S, as you can see on the second page, who is a psychotherapist and clinical supervisor in the health center at Williams College. He is former senior staff psychologist at the Austin Riggs Center and contributing editor of Psychoanalytic Dialogues. So please, Dr. Piers.
And I'm delighted to be part of this panel and together with very distinguished researchers, author, and scientists. Let me begin by just introducing the participants. And then I thought what we could do is say a little bit about, touch on some of the work that you're all doing, and then move to our topic, which is supposed to be around consciousness, which will probably inevitably move also to a discussion of the unconscious and other ideas about psychology, psychopathology, and other areas. So starting to my left, I'd like to introduce Ned Block. He's Silver Professor of Philosophy and Psychology at New York University. He's a former Guggenheim Fellow and Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is co-editor of The Nature of Consciousness, Philosophical Debates. Next is Joseph LeDoux. He is University Professor and Henry and Lucy Moses Professor of Science in the Center of Neuroscience in the Department of Psychology at New York University. He's director of an NIMH Conti Center for Neuroscience of Fear and Anxiety and author of The Emotional Brain, The Mysterious Underpinnings of Emotional Life, and The Synaptic Self, How Our Brains Become Who We Are. Next is Richard Heyer, is professor of psychology at the University of California, Irvine School of Medicine. He's used brain imaging with PET and MRI for the last 20 years to study intelligence. His most speculative work using brain imaging suggests a neurobiological basis for consciousness and a possible link to the neurological basis of intelligence. And finally, not least, Patrick McGrath. He's a novelist whose work touches on the subject of mental illness. He's the author of The Grotesque, Spider, Asylum, Martha Peak, and Port Mungo. Welcome all. So why don't we begin by just saying a little bit about the work we've done, our current work, and how it might link to some of the other, we may find links then to each other and begin our discussion. So why don't we start with your work? And
I am a philosopher and part of a growing movement in philosophy to think about philosophical issues that connect with the sciences. And so I've worked on quite a few different issues in the sciences that, for example, I did a project on intelligence, like Professor Heyer. And I did a project on mental imagery. For about the past 10 years, I've been working on consciousness. And I'm especially interested in the relation between mental states and their neural bases. And I'm right now writing a book on the neural basis of consciousness.
So I work on emotion and memory in the brain. I do most of this work through studies of rats. And we try to figure out exactly how it is that an emotional experience that a rat has is acquired and stored in the rat's brain. And the reason we do it in rats is because we can get into the detailed circuitry underlying all of this processing and go down beyond the circuit into the cells and the molecules and then perhaps learn something about the molecules that may help us come back up to the level of behavior, and perhaps even help treat people who have disorders. But we're not strictly focused on the development of drugs or anything like that, because we have other approaches where we try to use behavioral manipulations to alter fear and fear memory and change these as well. So I think it's important to realize that neuroscience is not, strictly speaking, a reductionistic science where you start at the top with behavior and go down to molecules and genes, because there are interactions at each step along the way. So genes can tell you about behavior, and behavior can tell you about genes, and every step in the middle can inform the other levels. So the idea is not to reduce so much, but to integrate across these various levels. I don't study consciousness per se. Most of my work has emphasized the unconscious nature of emotional processing, and maybe we can get around to that. But I think it's, I am, of course, interested in being a conscious person, and so I have written a little bit about it, mostly in a speculative way, because, again, I don't personally study it.
So what are the odds that the guy from California is the only one wearing a tie?
On the East Coast, 100%.
So I left California yesterday. It was 75 degrees. I grew up in Buffalo, so I'm not completely unused to this. I've been using brain imaging to look at how the brain works during various cognitive processes. About 12 years ago, a resident from our medical school came to see me. He was an anesthesiologist. And he said, "Can you help me do a brain imaging experiment to understand what anesthetic drugs do?" And I said, "You mean you don't know what anesthetic drugs do?" He said, "Well, we use these every day. Every day I turn consciousness on and I turn consciousness off. I start by turning it off, and then at will we turn it back on. And we don't have a clue how we do it. What I do is I give an anesthetic drug, and then we measure heart rate, we measure brain waves, we measure temperature, but none of that stuff predicts anything about how deeply someone is unconscious. So I stick them with a needle, and if they don't jump, I tell the surgeon to go ahead." So I was kind of shocked at this. And with that resident, whose name is Mike Alkire, who's now a faculty member at Irvine, we have done a series of brain imaging experiments on normal volunteers when they undergo various levels of anesthetic drugs to experimentally manipulate states of consciousness and look to see what the brain looks like in those different states. And we are interested in using this information to try to explicate the neurocircuitry of consciousness. And then I have an interest in whether that neurocircuitry overlaps with other studies we're doing on human intelligence and the neurocircuitry of intelligence. But more about all that later.
Well, in my line, the unconscious is probably more central than consciousness per se. I think there wouldn't be any literature if characters in novels didn't behave in inexplicable or irrational or unpredictable ways. We're left with the great questions as to why Madame Bovary cheats on her husband, or why Heathcliff believes in ghosts, or why Captain Ahab gives up chasing whales in general and chases one whale in particular. These are the mysteries of mind that without which literature, I think, would be very tedious indeed. My own work focuses on sort of the mind in crisis, the mind that is failing to properly assimilate what reality or the world is telling it. And probably the most vivid example in my own work is a 1990 novel called Spider, which is the first-person account of a man suffering from schizophrenia. And the story roughly goes that after a long period in an institution, he's returned to the place he grew up, which is the East End of London. and returning to a halfway house in this neighborhood and seeing those familiar streets, smelling those familiar smells, the sort of construction of his own past, his own narrative of his life, which centers on the great tragedy of his life, which was the death of his mother. When he's returned to the place where this tragedy occurred, his memories begin to collapse. It turns out that it's a false structure of memory that this man Spider has constructed in order to explain to himself the circumstances of his mother's death and to place responsibility for that death upon his father. And as these structures collapse, he begins to face the possibility that responsibility for his mother's death does not lie with his father, but elsewhere. And I made a curious discovery, without doing any theoretical work on this, that as this character's memory collapsed, so did his identity, which had been very fragile to begin with. But it sort of fractures and splinters as he is robbed of his own biography. And so the relationship of self and memory began to appear very much more sort of intimate than I'd first imagined. And in this way, a mystery of the mind was at least partially sort of revealed through the writing of the fiction.
Mm-hmm. Just a bit about the work. I'm principally a psychotherapist. Most of my time is spent listening to people and the troubles that they bring. And of course, much of my both training and also the way I work with people is attending to non-conscious processes and trying to understand pathways to symptoms and how that's related to unconscious processes. In terms of my writing, though, I've been, over the last 6 to 7 years, very interested in nonlinear self-organizing systems, and have moved to looking at building on the work of Stephen Wolfram and several people with these cellular automata, these computer-simulated Turing machines, which basically are arrays of cells that operate by simple transition rules, but then over time demonstrate complex behaviors, and trying to link that back to then what we're learning about neural networks, the brain, and how they too are circuits. And so what my work has moved toward is trying to find actually a bridging language from complexity theory or nonlinear dynamic systems and these, which really kind of graph theory, into the neurosciences, trying to find a psychological language that can bridge it so that really psychologists and people thinking about the mind can begin to add what they know about the mind to the discussion of the neuroscience of the mind in these language networks, these systems, and how these systems evolve and change over time. So that's principally what my work is about. But it does sound as though at least 2 members have done a fair amount on consciousness, and I think part of the agenda was to begin there. But it invariably will lead back to discussing unconscious processes as well. So I don't, Ned, if you want to say something about some of your work on consciousness and your thoughts about it, and maybe others then we can join in on.
Well, since the title of the session is involves the notion of a mystery, maybe I should say something about what I think the chief mysteries of consciousness are. I think probably the biggest mystery, at least the biggest mystery that is talked about in philosophy, is sometimes called the explanatory gap. And the issue is, how can we possibly explain why the neural basis of a given conscious experience is the neural basis of that experience rather than some other one or even none? I think it's fair to say that nobody really has a clue about the answer to this question. Often for questions that people are puzzled by, at least you can come up with some hypothetical answer. But I don't think there's even a hypothetical answer to this question that anybody's ever proposed. So I think this is really one of the biggest challenges to face the science of consciousness. At the same time, I don't think it's hopeless. I think that we have a kind of a set of ideas for at least sort of trying to see what the problem is, if not ideas that will help us in the solution, from work that a number of philosophers have done. The key distinction is the distinction between a concept and the thing that the concept is a concept of. A concept being a piece of representational machinery that we use in thinking. And so the idea, if you want to sort of get a physicalistic picture of what consciousness is, that at least allows you to state this explanatory gap. A good way to think about it is we've got a mentalistic concept of consciousness that we get from our own experience. And then we have various brain-oriented concepts of consciousness. And if a physicalistic point of view is right, these are both concepts of the same thing. Just as the concept of water that we all get from ordinary life, and the concept of water that we get from chemistry, namely, combination of hydrogen and oxygen molecules arranged in a certain way, those are two different concepts of the same thing. Or to take another example, temperature, something we're all familiar with in our daily life, but the physicists tell us that, at least in the case of a gas or a liquid, the temperature of a gas or a liquid is the average kinetic energy of the molecules of the liquid. So we've got two concepts, a physicalistic concept, average kinetic energy, and an ordinary concept, temperature, and they pick out the same thing. So the idea is that if we're going to understand the physical basis of consciousness, we're going to have to find a physical concept that picks out the same thing as our ordinary mentalistic concept. A colleague of mine at NYU, Tom Nagel, has a nice analogy using for this. He says we're in the position now that a pre-Socratic philosopher would have been in understanding how matter and energy could be forms of the same thing. You need to understand how matter and energy could be, probably most people in this room don't understand that. But we know, because we know at least that there is a science of these things, we have an idea of how we could find out those concepts and see that those concepts were concepts of the same thing. And that's what we unfortunately don't yet have, but we have a lot of, we have, definitely, we have investigations that have told us a lot about what it is about the brain that underlies our conscious experience. We're not there yet, but I think there is room for optimism.
Well, among those kind of correlates to consciousness that I'm aware of is the work of Gerald Edelman. I think Jürgen Feld did some work on memory, and they're talking, from my reading anyway, what comes out of it is that moments of synchronization across widely distributed and diverse areas of the brain correlate with moments of consciousness. So there was a study that Gerald Edelman did where subjects were put in a binocular rivalry study where they wore lenses. One lens was red, the other was blue. On a computer screen, they saw bars that were horizontal blue bars and vertical red bars. Yeah. And so perceptually what happens... Hello. Sorry. That's okay. Hi, I'm Craig Piers. Nice to meet you. Yeah, sure. Let me introduce our last panelist. Gianfranco Basti is Professor of Philosophy of Nature and Science at the Pontifical Lateran University and Director of the Vatican Project STOQ, Science, Theology, and Ontological Quest. Just in today, I think. Is that right?
Yes.
No? Welcome. We've started our discussion on touching on consciousness, but let me just to finish that study I was mentioning. So the subjects were put in this, they viewed on a computer screen vertical blue bars, red horizontal bars, and what happens subjectively for the subjects is that the percept alternates. They see blue bars, red bars, blue bars, and they're asked to press a key when the percept changed on them, indicating their moment of consciousness or becoming aware of a change in the percept. And what Edelman reported is that at those moments of becoming aware and pressing the key, there was massive synchronization across different areas, widely distributed areas of the cortex. And this is related to his idea of reentry and how it is that these networks, for brief moments, stabilize in these synchronized states. Then it's a washing away of it again until the next moment of consciousness. So that's what I understand to be, and there are several other studies that also speak of synchronization either in phase or in hertz, just cycles per second.
Craig, could I just cut in and ask you one thing, Ned? You're talking about the sort of the physicalist aspect of consciousness here, which you're going to say will one day correspond to whatever the mentalist concept. What for you is the mentalist concept of consciousness?
Well, I think that's a really important question, and I think one of the points that my colleague Tom Nagel makes is that you need clarification on both sides. It's not just that we need to find something in neuroscience that picks out the thing that our very well understood mentalistic concept of consciousness picks out. We need more work on the mentalistic concept. And, I think one thing that anybody discovers when they just begin to think about this is that when people use the word conscious, they mean many different things. One thing they often mean is self-consciousness. Another thing that they often mean is some kind of access. And a third thing that people mean is experience itself, that it's what it's like to have an experience of red as opposed to green. So I think that getting clear, and this is actually one place that philosophers can help and have done a lot of work, getting clear about just what we're talking about, just from an ordinary point of view, trying to think of cases and make some distinctions is really important. Let me just go back to what you said. This phenomenon you mentioned, called binocular rivalry. The general phenomenon is, and you can do this at home, if you use up some paper towels and get those little cardboard tubes, and you stick one on one eye and one on the other eye and put very different things in the two ends, you'll find that your experience oscillates. It's a lot like a Necker cube, except it's binocular. And of course, the interesting thing is to look in the brain and see what's changing. Your percept is changing, but nothing in your eyes. The stimulation to your eyes are staying constant. And what's found is there are some parts of the brain change more than others. And one really nice experimental result is one done by Nancy Canwisher at MIT, where she put a face in one eye and a house in the other eye, and found that the person's experience goes back and forth, face, house, and the key differences are in some areas on the bottom of the temporal lobe, she calls the fusiform face area, and another place she calls the perihippocampal place area. And those go on and off. And in fact, you can be 85% accurate in telling whether a person is experiencing a face or a house just using a scanner. And a naive observer can do it just with a little bit of training, 85% accuracy, which is really pretty impressive.
But that doesn't say that that's where consciousness is.
No, and I think this point that you mentioned about Edelman's work about oscillation, and especially focusing on oscillations involving the top of the brainstem, a little thing called the thalamus, those seem to be really crucial for the background of conscious experience. So very likely the fusiform face area, the perihippocampal place area, is a big part of the contents, the basis of the contents of consciousness. But then there's a background that makes those contents conscious, and that probably has something to do with oscillations involving the thalamus.
Would you say more, Joe? But
well, as Ned was saying, the when you're seeing house, the house area lights up. When you're seeing face, that lights up. But those, again, are, as you said, correlates of consciousness. It doesn't say that's the causal fact. A number of studies using similar kinds of stimuli show that, for example, if you present those kinds of stimuli in free vision, then you get certain areas of the brain that light up. And whereas if you mask the stimuli, fewer areas light up. In other words, if the stimulus is prevented from entering consciousness, you still get that face area and the house area for faces and houses. But when the stimulus is actually in consciousness, other areas, especially in the prefrontal cortex and other regions, tend to come on board. And that's, I think a lot is pointing towards some kind of prefrontal involvement. I'm not sure how everybody feels about that, but there's a lot pointing in that direction. And if that's true, that raises some interesting questions for the evolution of consciousness, because that part of the brain is the part that differs most in the human brain and other primates, and probably doesn't even exist in other mammals. So, I saw that part of the topic here was to talk about machine consciousness, but if we can't even, be confident about other animals, how can we go to a machine?
Can I say something about that? So I'm a bit of a skeptic about the point that Joe just made. I think that prefrontal involvement is probably connected not with the experience itself, but with our cognitive access to it. Right. So what I think is that these lower animals that have, say, have a visual system not that different from our own, but not much frontal cortex, are probably having experiences, but they're not. They don't have the kind of cognitive system that we do.
Right. But then that gets into the question that you raised: is access the answer, or is it the experience, or I forget what the third one was? But
yeah, let me say actually something else about the thalamocortical oscillations. Sure. Now, I hadn't realized until you mentioned Alkire that I read a paper of his a while ago. Maybe you're a part of it, maybe you're a joint author on it, which I thought was a terrific paper explaining...
Tell me which one it is before I admit
it's the one, A1, that it's a review paper on what's in common to different anesthetics. And, there needn't be anything in common to different anesthetics. They all might, work on some piece of the circuitry of consciousness. But as it happened, I thought when I read this article, I was blown away. Because what this article says, look, as it happens, they all really seem to come down to, or almost everything, almost all things that we use as anesthetics, seem to knock out there's something common to them, which is this thalamocortical circuit. That's a really impressive result in my view.
Well, Mike has written a couple of reviews of all this work, but we have collaborated on the individual studies of different anesthetic drugs looking for the common neurocircuitry. The idea being if you can find what is in common among drugs that allegedly work in different ways on different neural pathways, you'll find this basic circuitry. But kind of the interesting concept here is if you find the neurocircuitry of anesthetic drugs and what turns unconsciousness on, is that the same as turning consciousness off? So can you look at what parts of the brain are the last parts of the brain to turn off just as someone slips out of consciousness? And then you can ask the question, are they the same parts of the brain that turn on as the person regains consciousness? And I'm not so sure it's the same brain areas based on this work.
Can you tell us more?
No.
But maybe you can send me a reference.
Mike is preparing, I think, a new review on this that I think is startling, and he's been doing some rat work, actually, trying to introduce some anesthetics in particular parts of the brain to test some of these ideas experimentally. Remember, there's correlational studies and then there are experimental studies. One of the nice things about certain kinds of brain imaging is you can do experiments in live human beings without hurting them. And when we bring humans in and anesthetize them into different states, it's kind of interesting. In the very first study we published in 1995, there were some individuals, we tested people in 3 different states, same person 3 different days. Once when fully awake, once when fully anesthetized, And once when they got enough anesthetic drugs so they were barely conscious. So you say, Tom, can you hear me? Tom would go, yeah. Anybody know this state? And the question is, what does the brain look like? What does the brain look like in that state? When you're deeply anesthetized and unconscious, your brain is more turned off than during non-REM sleep, but not quite as much as when you're in a coma. Which, if you think about it, that's just where you want to be for surgery. Yeah. But when you're in this barely conscious state, there are certain brain areas that are more active than when you're awake. Now, are those the brain areas kind of struggling to maintain consciousness? And they're interesting brain areas. They have to do with dopamine, the reward system. So we can learn a lot about the neural basis, but that really begs the question of what's the relationship between the neural basis and the actual experience. And it's somewhere between determinism and dualism. There's going to be an E = mc squared answer. And I don't think it'll be in the chaos models because they're too complicated. They're not elegant. Whatever the solution turns out to be, it has to be an E = mc squared type solution. You know, an equation that's no longer than 2 inches.
Well, I think there's...
Because the world is elegant. Science reveals, everything that science reveals is essentially elegant. Freud's ideas have a certain elegance about them. They may be right, they may be wrong, but they're elegant. I just am so excited that we're having this conversation in the psychoanalytic building. I'm sure if Freud were alive today, he would be doing brain imaging experiments. And many writers and novelists would be coming to him asking, do you have any results, Dr. Freud, that will help me expand my unconsciousness? Because isn't that, if there were a pill that worked on neurocircuits, and notice I say pill because I don't want to use the pejorative word drug, but if there were a pill or a medicine that worked on neurocircuits in the brain that would cause more bubbling up of the unconscious into consciousness. Freud liked that idea. Would you as a novelist sign up to take this?
Well, I think all that work was largely done in the 19th century when you have the great flowering of the Gothic novel. And in a way, Freud comes along just as the sort of the last great Gothicist to build on the work that had been done by Oscar Wilde and Bram Stoker and Robert Louis Stevenson and Edgar Allan Poe. And I mean, if you have any doubt about that, just look at the titles of the 3 case studies: The Rat Man, The Wolf Man, The Psychotic Dr. Schreber. That's a Gothic writer.
But I didn't hear you answer the question. Would you take this pill to expand your unconsciousness on the idea that it might make you even a better novelist?
Oh, sure.
You would.
Yep.
Would you pay $10,000 for it?
Yeah.
Now, we don't have a pill, but we have, as you know, a technology that can temporarily disable certain parts of the brain. It's called transcranial magnetic stimulation. You take this coil and you put it on somebody's head and you can aim it pretty precisely and it knocks something out. So if we could knock out a substantial part of the of what would be needed to let the unconscious bubble up,
I don't think Freud would think that was necessarily a good idea. I'm focusing on novelists and creative people. It might be good for creativity, but you might not be able to handle what bubbles up from your unconscious. That would be kind of the common psychoanalytic view, wouldn't it?
I think just as we need better definitions of consciousness, we'd have to talk about definitions of unconscious too.
I think that's important.
It's like pornography, hard to define, but you know it when you see it.
But a lot of it's not going to bubble up even if it could, because the parts of the brain involved in certain emotions, for example, don't necessarily communicate directly with cortical areas that might give you access to that information. So, for example, no amount of probing is going to pull a memory out of the amygdala and put it into the hippocampus so that it can be consciously accessed through prefrontal cortex. This came up in the false memory debate. So some of my work was sometimes used to argue that unconscious emotional memories stored in the amygdala as bodily response patterns that are released by external stimuli, with enough therapy and work, could be made consciously accessible, and therefore by putting that memory into the hippocampus. And I tend to think of it as, it's like Swahili and Japanese. It's like a different code because the circuitry is very different. The information being represented in those parts of the brain are very different, and it's not going to be easily translated from one to the other. So there are aspects of the unconscious that are simply inaccessible because there's no circuitry that makes it accessible. Then there are other parts that would be more like what Freud called the preconscious, which is potentially accessible but not being accessed or difficult to access. And then other things that might fall into the category of repression that were conscious that have been made unconscious and now kind of locked up. And that, I think, is what you're talking about in terms of allowing to bubble up.
Yeah, I think it's actually a very important distinction. And I think it's true that I've read it anyway, Joe. It's particularly true of your work. When you write about, I think in one of your books you said 90% of what's going on is unconscious. I think, well, some very high number. I think a lot of people in the psychoanalytic community felt this was finally vindication.
Right.
You see, we've said all along, most of what's happening is happening unconsciously. And I think that's a blurring of non-conscious with our traditional understanding of the unconscious. The idea that the unconscious it's an active repudiation, a disavowal of something both known but not want to know, and a forcing through various forms of defense. That's a very different form than what you're describing. In your definition of unconscious, you're including language, access to language, understanding language and speech, forming words. All those things are happening unconsciously the way you write about it. But I think that is often, because if you're at all sympathetic to psychoanalysis, and often the way it gets bashed in terms of its lack of scientific evidence, when a scientist says a lot of what's happening is unconscious, there's a wish to kind of jump on that and say, you see. But I think it's important to keep those distinctions clear. I don't think Freud traditionally was speaking of just non-conscious aspects of brain function, or even the mind.
Right. I think actually it's worse than what you're saying. I mean, given what Joe's story, sounds like it really is incompatible with Freudian theory, because if it's really true that the reason the amygdala representations can't get to the hippocampus and get globally broadcast across the brain is that they're in a code that these more cognitive parts of the brain don't understand, then it's a little hard to see how the mechanisms of repression could possibly work on them.
But we have to realize that there are multiple memory systems, right? So the amygdala is storing it. Let's take a particular situation where a person is traumatized in some way. So the amygdala will be storing sensory cues and other aspects of that relevant to that trauma that later could reactivate a fight-flight type of response simply on the basis of Pavlovian conditioning. So the cues are there, the cue is presented, the body responds again. At the same time, though, during the trauma, other parts of the brain, like the hippocampus, will be storing a cognitive representation of that experience, including the fact that it was awful and really bad and stuff, but in a kind of cold cognitive way. Now, when the stimuli later appear, it's going to activate both systems, one giving rise to this cognitive memory, the other the unconscious emotional memory, and both of these will then be fused in consciousness as a single new experience that can be restored in various ways. Now, if to get back to the Freudian aspect of this, though, what we now know is that some aspects of what have been thought of in terms of not simple, but just repression, might have a biological basis, which is in a traumatic, stressful situation, stress hormones are released that negatively impair the hippocampus, but positively facilitate the amygdala. So you're forming a stronger unconscious memory, while at the same time a weaker conscious memory. So that you could then have a very poor understanding of why you react fearfully to certain events, but at the same time have very strong emotional reactions to those events. Now, the problem is, if the hippocampus didn't store it consciously during the experience, it can't be consciously retrieved later. Now, of course, there's a gray ground in between, because it takes a while for these hormones to have their effect. So there's always probably at least some hippocampal storage, and that's where the therapeutic process may be able to reach in and try to pull things out. But you're dealing with features and fragments of the experience at that point. And that's where the opportunity for false memories come about, because you have incomplete information that was stored about the experience in the first place.
But the reason that I think this is incompatible with the Freudian picture is there's no mechanism of repression. There's nothing cognitive that is saying, I don't want to know about this. It's only, from what your description is, it's only a matter of a strong amygdala emotional signal and a weak cognitive one in the hippocampus.
Right, but I'm giving the boring neurobiological version. I mean, there are studies.
Well, where is there room for repression?
Well, there are psychological studies of directed forgetting and so forth, where you can teach people to not have access to things that you don't want them to have access to.
But it does. It's exactly where I'd like to actually see the research go. And thinking about in terms of defense, that is that studying what are the neurobiological correlates of self-deception. Something we all know about, that people practice on a regular, that is deceiving oneself about something you also know. What are the neural correlates for that? And that would be getting close to ideas of active repression or disavowal of something. And of course we know the research on self-deception is large, but I don't think it's moved into anywhere in terms of neuroscience. There's not neuroscientists interested in that topic, and that seems to me to be very interesting. And particularly as compared to consciousness, because that's a different form of, would be a different form of being not conscious of something that you are at the same time conscious of, and think about what the correlates might be.
So what are the, can you tell us a bit about the conscious and unconscious states that of anesthesia and brain systems and so forth?
The drugs that render you unconscious tend to work in the deeper areas of the brain, the arousal areas, tend to turn those off. Turns off connections through the thalamus to the frontal lobes. In some ways, not a great surprise. The circuits are very much like the sleep circuits. But the real question is understanding the flip side of these circuits in terms of maintaining what we call consciousness. These circuits, I think, are somewhat independent of memory circuitry. So I don't think you need to talk about memory at all in a discussion of consciousness. As a matter of fact, one of the things I learned in that very first conversation I had with Mike Alkire that I related to you, as an anesthesiologist, he gives two types of drugs in every surgery. He gives an anesthetic to render the person unconscious, and he gives a memory blocking drug should the person spontaneously regain consciousness with no warning during surgery, which does happen from time to time. This memory disrupting drug will be sure the patient has no memory of the event.
And doesn't sue for no.
Right.
And this is common common anesthesiology practices.
Is this after the reports of people remembering?
This has been going on for
jokes
a long time.
Said about them.
A long time.
Well, what's the memory blocking drug?
I don't know.
Valium. It's a relative of Valium.
I don't know if it's just Valium.
It's called.
Sorry.
Ned, can I, Ned, circle back to something you said that wasn't altogether clear to me? We're talking about trauma and the repression of traumatic experience. And from my reading of the treatment of PTSD, at least at Judith Herman's account, there is an eliciting of the trauma story as a sort of central period of central phase of treatment. When not only the event itself is brought into consciousness, but the context, the bodily sensations, the emotional aspect of it, and the meaning of it is brought out in therapy. And when that experience has been fully developed, presumably with amygdala and hippocampal elements involved in that reproduction of the experience, then that is assimilated into the self, and then some sort of healing it occurs. I don't know why that is in conflict with Freudian theory of repression.
My point was extremely simple, and I'm not saying that it is in conflict. I'm saying that there is a certain problem about the connection to the Freudian story, and that is, at least on his version of the Freudian story, and that is that the amygdala speaks a different language from the rest of the, or at least the cognitive part of the brain. If the amygdala speaks a different language, it's a little hard to see how there could be a more cognitive part of the brain that says, gosh, that thing in the amygdala is so awful, I don't want to think about it.
That's the emotional storage, is it?
Yes, but the trouble is the hippocampus doesn't understand it.
Right, but what the hippocampus, what repression is doing is suppressing the cognitive representation. So a thought can activate an emotion very easily, but it's not very good at turning it off, and that's an asymmetry that we don't understand at all.
Can't I remember an emotion?
Yes, you can remember an emotion in two ways. One, cognitively.
Yeah.
You know, that such and such happened to me, God, that was awful, and I really wish I could forget that, and that's where the repression could come in, because it's, you know, it's cognitive control over a cognitive memory. What repression is not going to do is get rid of the emotional memory itself stored in the amygdala, which can be re-triggered. I mean, we know that people with phobia, for example, or PTSD can be completely healed and functioning perfectly well, but some irrelevant stress comes along, like the death of the mother, and the phobia or the trauma comes all back in full force. So these memories are living in the brain at a time when they're not being accessed. I mean, we sometimes say fear is forever, because it can always be brought back in a,
yes.
in a
But
way.
look, the point about his theory that is problematic for the Freudian picture is that the only way you get access to one of these disturbing memories is via its cognitive representation. And that is linked in a sort of, I guess, a brute way with the amygdala representation. If you haven't got that cognitive representation in the hippocampus or somewhere in the frontal cortex where the hippocampus has put it, if you haven't got it, you can't link to the amygdala representation. So
what about a spontaneous emotional memory flooding consciousness? Would that not be the amygdala somehow uncoding
yes, if something
in consciousness?
triggers it, I guess the story is you'll get that flood of emotion.
Right.
But the question is, can you, through the process of psychoanalysis, elicit an amygdala emotion representation? Answer, on his theory, only if there's also a cognitive representation that links to it. So if you haven't got that, remember his story was that tends to go away in a traumatic event. So if you haven't got that, I mean, I guess the compatibility with Freudian theory depends on that cognitive representation not being completely fragmented and destroyed.
So this is sort of a sidetrack, but I think it's relevant. So those of you who are therapists probably know that it's pretty easy to treat a snake phobia or a fear of heights and so forth through cognitive behavioral exposure therapy in a relatively small number of sessions, whereas through psychoanalysis it could take much, much longer. And one of the biological explanation of that is that the part of the prefrontal cortex involved in extinction, which is part of exposure therapy, talks directly to the amygdala. Whereas the lateral prefrontal cortex, where you have working memory and you put things in the forefront of the mind and you access your long-term memories and you reevaluate them and you restore them and all that, doesn't talk to the amygdala at all. So no amount of talking about it is going to change the emotional representation in the amygdala, only by doing. It's a process of learning by doing. You expose the person to the stimulus and have them go through various behavioral activities that change the way they interact with that stimulus. And I was recently talking to Bessel van der Kolk, who obviously many of you will know as a trauma therapist, who has built this concept. We wrote about this in the American Journal of Psychiatry after 9/11, that through animal research we had shown that learning by doing is much more effective in getting rid of fear than simply passively responding to the fear stimulus. And so he's been developing these role acting and drama therapy things that he finds very effective as a way of treating PTSD, because the person is actively engaged in personally changing what they're doing rather than simply talking about it. It's involving the whole body and the whole mind in a positive engagement experience.
Would you like to jump in? You haven't had a chance. It must be hard.
I am hearing because it's very interesting, but I am a little I am in a little different position in this sense that as a researcher I work a lot about another type of approach, because you are speaking about the relationship between consciousness and brain state, and you use terms like coding, like circuitry, like information, and so, sorry, I work on the other side. That is, for me, the problem is how the brain manipulates information. What is the relationship between information as we use in biology or neuropsychology and the notion of information as used in this computer, and how the complex dynamics of brain, chaotic dynamics. Originally this meeting was also for make a commentary about Freeman's book. You know, Walter Freeman's approach is strictly related with the discovery of chaotic dynamics in the brain, and so one of the most puzzling and fascinating problem for me, but for many also physicists, is how chaos can manipulate information, and how is it possible to use chaotic dynamic networks, chaotic dynamic system, on neural networks based on chaotic dynamics, like it is the brain, for solving, for instance, quantitative problems of memorization. Because you know that the enormous amount of memory, of information storing that is possible, for instance, in brain, but also the same problem we have in genetics when we use some idea that all the information is in the genetic code. A winner at the beginning of the informational approach to the genetics made a very simple calculus, because science is also mathematics, at least hard science. And so very simple calculus, because you know that we have 10 power 17 cells in our adult body, okay? And so all of them derives from one only cell before cutting it, that is. And so, you know, it's very simple when you study information theory at school, that if I have here a system that I need 1 bit for putting the system here, and 1 bit for choice between two different lines. And so 2 bit for one choice, and then 4 bit for 2 choices, 8 bit 2 power 3 for a choice. So when we pass from 1 to 10 power 17, we need an amount of information, if information is coded in this way, of 2 power 10 power 17. That is a number that cannot be calculated at all. No matter in the universe can embody all this information. So it is obvious that information, as is computed in biological system and also in brain, is absolutely different from information as we are acquainted with the Shannon theory of information and so on. And so my approach as a scientist, that is a computer scientist in this field, and as a philosopher of science, is this, that is, we have consciousness, that is something subjective. You asked for, please give me a definition of consciousness. It is like to ask a physicist, please give me a definition of energy. You cannot give, because it's a primitive notion. That as you use energy in physics, you cannot explain energy in physics, but you suppose that exists. So that in psychology, as far as you have to do with consciousness, you cannot define consciousness, because it is a primitive for the distinction between physiology or neurology and psychology. Otherwise, they're the same. And so also when, for instance, I brought with me this last number of time because it seems positively prepared for our meeting. So they discussed a lot of things. Oh, here there is a very, very simple mistake that is made over on all the papers here. That is, because it is obvious that each mental state is related with the neural state. So surely brain states have some causal influence on the mental state, and this is now scientific evidence. The mistake is this, that is to confuse necessary condition, I'm a philosopher of science, a logician too, necessary condition with sufficient condition. Because it is evident that each psychological state, each conscious state has a correlate in the brain, also the more mystic one. And I am a priest, and so I worked also a lot about the psychology of mystic experience of saints and so on. And for Catholics, that is, I am Catholic, and I am also Aristotelian as a philosopher, is absolutely obvious that also the more spiritual experience that you have has a physical basis. Because my approach, not only as a philosopher, as Aristotelian, but also as a scientist, as a computer scientist, the brain state is not only matter. The brain state is matter and form, energy and information. And energy and information. And information is a metaphor that is cannot be distinguished from energy and so from matter. Only if you consider a classic Turing machine, that is the computer according to the mechanistic approach of the Turing machine. I don't know if all the people is acquainted with this notion, but because effectively for implementing the calculus of a Turing machine I need a stable stationary system from the physical standpoint. That is, I need essentially linear dynamic system. And otherwise you cannot predict the final state. And there are a lot of bibliography on these topics that all the classical mechanical physics, all the classical mechanics, the Newtonian mechanics, you can simulate by a Turing machine, that is by a classical computer, because are two ways, two different connotations of the same denotatum, like the morning star and the evening star denotate the same object, that is the Venus planet. Okay, it's famous. But if you work with nonlinear systems, unstable and non-stationary, like a chaotic system is, and like the brain dynamics is, and like a lot of metabolic systems are, you have this strange phenomenon that without absolutely violating the principle of energy conservation, you have a system that can generate information. That is, the puzzle of the genetic code, but it's not a code, because a code in information theory means something related with a Turing machine. So it's not a code. That is, does not preview the branching till the adult, okay? It's not a code in a technical sense. So the secret is this, that the organism growing up generate information through the relationship also with the environment. And the same is in the brain. That is, the brain, the ability of the brain is to produce a surplus of information. But this surplus of information is not some spirit, okay, despite probably, okay, you are a priest, and so in this way demonstrate what is the spirit, okay, no. After, if we have time, but what is I wrote 1 year ago a nice paper, according to nice, is from information to spirit. And then, this surplus of information is related with the capability of the system to generate information that is not given in the initial conditions. And so the correlate of consciousness, or the subjectivity of consciousness, is not only the energetic flow, okay, that is the circuitry that we can reveal by brain imaging, like a tester. If I put a tester in this on this computer for measuring the energy exiting from each transistor, I have the information flow. I make the image of this computer, the imaging, like our colleagues and neurophysiologists make. That is, they put the tester. The tester is electroencephalography, PET, and so on, so on, so on. All the system, magnetic resonance, and so on. But they give us, in this way, the energetic flow of the brain. And it's very nice to see how this energetic flow is related with the conscious state that is expressed by the patient, that is, by the person which brain you are observing. But the other correlate of this subjective state is the information manipulated by the brain. And so, where in a chaotic system put information, and the chaotic system has the capability of information storing that effectively human brain seems to have, but we don't know how it have. For instance, in this discussion about information, what I appreciate a lot is that it is completely overcome the old approach of the grandmother cell. That is to suppose that the brain memorizes information like the hard disk of a computer in some physical space, so that I have the cell for recovering, for remembering my grandmother, my sister, and so on. No. Is the dynamics between hippocampus, between limbic system, okay, amygdala, hippocampus, and so on, and cortex. And this completely agree what we expect from the standpoint of the chaotic dynamics approach and for information processing in the complex system. And so I want to stop here, otherwise I speak before, I don't speak now, I speak too much. So in equilibrium, okay. But the chaotic systems are stable, far from equilibrium. This is nice. And so I agree in a lot of this type. For instance, also when you spoke about synchronization, this is phenomena that we can simulate very easily with the chaotic system that is in the laboratory, and with properties very, very nice that we can correlate easily also what the neurophysiologists find in the brain by studying real brain. So I want to stop and only for saying what is my approach. That is, my approach is an objective study of brain, of consciousness, means not only the energetic flow, okay, the energetic imaging of the brain, but also the information processing in the brain. The information processing in the brain is not the information processing of bit in a computer. And one of the most intriguing mysteries for scientists today, for physicists today, is to study how a nonlinear system can generate and manipulating information. And the brain is surely one of the topics for the best study in this field. And I stop.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I'm not sure how much about I understood, but so your view is that you can only have consciousness in a system in which information is created.
Yes.
And if I understood right, I'm not sure if I did, a Newtonian system can't create information.
Yes, indeed.
Because after all, in a Newtonian system, the laws of nature combine to form a a computable function
Yes.
from this current state to a state at any later time.
Indeed.
So is it your view that if this were a Newtonian world, we could not have a conscious creature?
Yes, I mean, the only possible theory of consciousness compatible with the Newtonian approach.
No, I'm asking if we did have a Newtonian world, there could be no consciousness.
Absolutely not.
So,
it's impossible.
so consciousness requires these non-Newtonian aspects.
Yes, but life. Before, I think, chemistry before, and life, and then psychology or requires non-Newtonian physics. Indeed, this is the state of art of physics today.
You said in the beginning that you think information is created when a single cell develops into a whole creature.
Yes, a lot of
What is the argument that the information isn't all in the genome? Or some combination between the genome and maybe the amniotic environment?
Yes, indeed. That is not put in the because the DNA is a very limited system. Okay, for implementing a bit that is a 0-1 state, I need some material support, and it is calculated that in the DNA of humans, no more than some 10 or some 100 of megabyte can be implemented. So it's too few for defining the possibility of all the information is stored there. And so is in the complex dynamics, in the interaction between the nonlinear process driven as a slow variable, okay, because the stability of DNA is the secret of its capability of driving, okay, the chemistry reactions in the cell. And so, in the complex dynamics generated by the interaction between the DNA and the rest of the environment, so that overcoming completely the false dichotomy between genetics and ambientalists. Okay, you remember in the beginning of last century, the American school against the Russian school, geneticists against ambientalists. Okay, it's not true because it's the continuous interaction between the dynamics of driven by DNA and the rest of the environment that the generation is created. The information is created. But information is created, it seems something strange. That is unpredictable.
Can I interrupt for a second? So just to get straight, is this I mean, I haven't seen your numbers, but is this calculation accepted by scientists who are not affiliated with the church?
Yes, normally. All the people, all the people.
I've never heard any scientists.
Who are physicists. All the people who are physicists accepted this, that in a chaotic system you have there is the name of self-organizing system, self-regulating system.
Yeah, but those can be Newtonian systems.
No, absolutely no. Because Newtonian dynamics means that your system is completely predictable. That is, you remember the third principle of Newtonian dynamics is equilibrium principle, action and reaction. Okay, so that all the information that you have at the beginning, you have also at the end. For this reason, it's predictable. If you work with nonlinear, the notion of complexity, what means? It means exactly this, that you cannot reduce to only one model completely predictable the dynamic of the system. If you take a chaotic attractor, okay, he has as a stable point, okay, each possible point of the trajectory in the phase space. That is, each point of the trajectory in the phase space can potentially become a stable point of the dynamics. On the contrary, in a classical Newtonian dynamics, you have one stable point. It's the equilibrium state, the minimum of energy.
I have a different topic I'd like to bring up if we could. We often treat consciousness as the big problem we have to solve, but I think there's a bigger problem that we face that consciousness is part of, which is something that you said, which is the self. And consciousness is obviously an important part of the self, but it's not the whole self. Much of who we are as people operates unconsciously as well. So I'd just like to get back to the topic of the self, and maybe you have some more to say about that from your novels.
Well, this was the novel in which I watched a self-fragmenting. It seemed that by the study of schizophrenia that one could see by the sort of the pathology of the self, what the structure of the self was.
You seem to be implying that as the conscious memories were being fragmented, but if we take for example a patient with early Alzheimer's disease who is losing conscious memory, but they're still walking around and they're still recognizable as the same person. There's a lot that's underneath consciousness that maintains who we are, even though the person that we know internally is beginning to change. To the outside world, a person can look perfectly normal because the self is being maintained, even though consciously they're falling apart.
I think one would begin to detect the signs. I mean, I suppose the operating idea that I had was that we are constituted to a large extent by our memories. That gives us a sense of what our biography is. We carry that narrative. Within that narrative we play the role of protagonist in our own life, some variation usually, I think, of hero or victim, and we probably flip-flop around between those various roles that we see ourselves playing. And what was of great interest in studying a man suffering from schizophrenia was that as the world was systematically and radically contradicting his story about himself and the role that he had played in that story, so he was unable to sustain the sort of the integrity or the cohesiveness of a self that could operate in the world, and so the system began to break down. The hallucinations became more frequent and more disturbing. The sort of somatic distortions became increasingly sort of wild and grotesque. His inability to interact socially became more pronounced. So he became an isolated, lonely, pathetic figure, sort of mumbling to himself, and there were various other sort of symptoms of this sort of breakdown of the self. One of which was an olfactory hallucination that a smell of gas was coming off of him, which required him first of all to wrap his body, in which there were no organs left, in newspaper and string. After which he put on all of his clothes at the same time. And you may have seen this in the streets of New York. People who are wearing all of their clothes over a layer of newspaper, entirely isolated socially, mumbling to themselves, chain smoking, and they are other. But the point of the novel was to say it can be mapped. It can be. You can track how an individual can get to this place, and in that way, I was trying to sort of say, a psychotic condition like this is comprehensible within, this chaos is comprehensible and manageable within the orderly structure of a novel.
Did you study schizophrenia in order to write this?
I'd grown up the son of a psychiatrist, so I'd had it at the at the dinner table for a number of years. My father actually ran the largest top security mental hospital in England, a place called Broadmoor, for many years. So I come by it honestly, and then I read I did some work in mental hospitals, and then read, and I was looking for something that would give me an imaginative sort of opening into schizophrenic experience, And it came from a book of Lang's, The Divided Self, where he described the experience of schizophrenia as being dying of thirst in a world of wet. And that seemed to capture it, and that sort of opened the door into what it must be like to be locked into this sort of bizarre system of first of all, hallucinations. So the world is perceptually disordered, your memories are crumbling, your self is losing all stability and cohesion, and all around you is that which you need, is the comfort of others. And you're not able to gain access to it. So you become more and more isolated, more and more lonely, more and more crazy, and you walk through the world, and we see them on the streets of our cities. And it was just an attempt to make sense of that condition of psychotic derangement.
Let me ask you a question that's related to this issue. So, this is something that I haven't really looked into, and I'm curious about. I know that when people talk about the neural bases of the self, they seem to talk about quite different things. So one thing that people often talk about is a sense of ownership of experience, which some people locate in part of the parietal lobe. But there are certainly lots of other things that make up a self, or at least a sense of self. So do you have any views about what the neural bases of the self are?
Right, well,
maybe you have some ideas about this as well.
My book,
first.
Synaptic Self, was on that topic. The basic point there was that we often talk about nature and nurture as if those were different things, but those are really two ways of doing the same thing, which is wiring synapses. So all of the things you have in your brain that determine your behavior from genetics only are expressed through synaptic connections that develop as you are growing in early life. And then experience does the same thing. So each time you learn something, you're also changing synapses. So the synapse is kind of the bottleneck of the self, of the person.
But of the whole mind, not just the self.
The whole mind, right, yes.
But I'm talking about something more specific to the self.
Right, well, for me, self is more like what you might call personality. So it's
so I'm talking about something really quite different, which is not just the personality, but what makes us have a self. You can imagine a creature that has a personality, but at least doesn't have a sense of ownership of experience, of being the creator of
right. Well, that's your definition
actions.
of a self. So.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not trying to define the self.
I hear yours is much more comprehensive. It includes aspects, the wiring through experience, what you come in with, and then what's
who you are is basically
learned through experience through the wiring of these networks becomes who you are. But that's far more comprehensive than the idea of what I might recognize as
it's
myself.
Like William James said, every
self.
time two people meet, there are at least six people there. The person that, as you know yourself, as other people think of you, and as the other person is thinking of you at the moment. So, but all of those things are part of who you are, and I think this is. We don't have a theory of the brain at this point that could explain how an individual has a personality and how that personality shapes what they do. We have understandings of emotion, of memory, even to some extent of consciousness, but we don't really understand what the self is of the person.
When people lose consciousness and then they regain consciousness, they often ask, where am I? They virtually never ask, who am I?
Right.
I think this is a hint.
Right, well, the self is a memory. It's a very complex set of memories that include genetic memories of who you are as a member of a species, as well as who you are as a person and all the things that have made you up.
I mean, there could be disagreements about how to, for instance, I'm thinking of cases of psychopathology in terms of personality. There are disagreements how to slice up various appearances, but there's general agreement that you can classify various forms of personality disorders. What interests me is with the level of variation of both experience, how these networks can come together, the possible, I think this is part of what you were getting at, it's an infinite number of possibilities if you talk about the wiring up of these networks, how actually there are probably a dozen. And psychosis too. There are there's a limited number of pathological forms of the human mind. and how that interests me in terms of the vastness of the network and how they break down in a relatively small number of ways, and trying to understand that link.
I mean, one of the problems in neuroscience and trying to get to these more complex issues is we tend to study, vertically within a single system rather than horizontally across systems. So, we can study long-term potentiation in the hippocampus. But when a person is learning something or having some experience, networks all over their brain are changing. Mm-hmm. But we're not studying that sort of lateral aspect of how the brain is working. We do research on a very narrow slice of an experience and some, not minor, but some fraction of what's going on. So a person is a set of perceptions, memories, emotions, conscious experiences, unconscious states, and all kinds of things, but we don't know how all that fits together.
This is where brain imaging has really pushed neuroscience ahead, right, because brain imaging for the last 20 years has had techniques that assess the whole brain simultaneously. So when many scientists started using brain imaging in the early 1980s, they felt the need to have an a priori hypothesis about what part of the brain would light up in a particular task. Much to their surprise, even if that part of the brain did light up, so did many others. And there were actually brain imaging papers published early on where the pictures, those nice brain pictures with the color blobs, were doctored to remove all the blobs for which there was no a priori hypothesis. Now, this wasn't because the scientists were trying to suppress that on a conscious level. They were just saying, hey, we don't know how to interpret this. I did some collaborations with cognitive people early on, and they just could not get their hands around the idea that brain areas other than the narrow system they were interested in would also light up. Right. And to this day, it's hard to integrate all that information. And so in some ways, the scientific model of only talking about what you have an a priori hypothesis, that is what you have a theory about, the technology has really superseded that. So now we're really forced in a post hoc way to pretend like you had the a priori hypothesis.
But I think probably most people are still ignoring those other blobs.
I think that's fair to say. And the other thing that got ignored early on that's beginning to get some attention is the fact that if a part of the brain would light up in an experiment, you had to ask the question, does it light up to the same degree in every subject in that experiment? And typically it doesn't. There are vast individual differences in the brain. Vast. And correlating the amount of activation or the amount of deactivation, equally important, to individual differences is really quite important and now possible with these techniques.
And the other thing you might comment on that I know from participating in a few of these studies, that by setting, if you raise the threshold high enough, the whole brain is active, right? So you keep lowering the threshold till you see only what you want to show.
Well, you're talking about lowering a statistical threshold.
Right.
And you want to know, is this part of the brain statistically more active than the rest of the brain? And you're right. At some point, the brain is always active. There's no part of the brain that's not active during any experiment. The only question is whether the activity is related to something in your experiment or not.
And don't they do that, lower the threshold based on not what the individual is doing, but the whole group is doing? Isn't it taken as a group of subjects, and
that's beyond my knowledge?
You throw out the noise. It's considered noise, individual noise, and you throw it out because you're trying to.
Well, this gets me into a whole rant about the way cognitive psychology approaches the world is by looking for what's common among people and ignoring what's different. So you might have a very intensive effort to understand learning and memory in general, and at the end of that, the test for me is, can you tell me why a particular child learns faster than another child in school? So that's when we'll know we understand something about learning and memory.
It's true that neuroscience is a science of the ordinary. and we have no understanding of individual differences.
Very few cognitive psychologists, very few, ever address the concept of intelligence. They will talk about learning, they will talk about memory, and intelligence in some ways is nothing but individual differences in learning and memory. But you can go to a lot of cognitive psychology textbooks and find no entry in the index for intelligence. There's something about this that is just a little scary. And of course, intelligence has to be related to the integration of the different parts of the brain. It's the integration that really counts, I think.
So can you tell us about this thing that you mentioned, that you say that there's some relation between intelligence and consciousness? What would that be?
Well, on a conceptual level, we talk about individual differences in intelligence. Is there anyone in this room who thinks they're not smarter than somebody else in this room? So that just cuts right away any criticism that we don't know what intelligence is, and it's hard to measure and hard to define. Nonsense. You all know what it is, and you all know you're smarter than at least somebody. So however you define it's okay with me. So think about consciousness now. We have different definitions of consciousness. Let's just talk about awareness. Where we have individual differences in intelligence, I think everybody would agree with this. Let's ask the question, can you have individual differences in consciousness? So it's consciousness all or none. Are you awake or asleep? So looking around this room right now, I perceive individual differences in consciousness. Some of you right now are more conscious than others. And I can tell. Some of you are literally nodding off. And some of you are listening very intently. So, can we measure individual differences in consciousness?
Sounds like you're talking about attention, not consciousness.
I would say awareness. I'll go with awareness. Now, if you have two children, you know there are individual differences. Two or more children, you know there are individual differences in consciousness. Right? If you have one child, you may not be sure. But if you have two or more children and you take them when they're young over here to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and you spend a couple hours and you go home and you say, what did you see? What did you enjoy? And one kid will talk about all kinds of stuff, even stuff that you didn't point out. And the other kid will say, well, that was really boring. I didn't really see anything. But one has absorbed information and the other hasn't. Is it because the one child is more conscious than the other? Is there something about that child's brain that is integrating the stimulation of the museum? Oh yes, I saw something on television that reminds me of this. Is that brain working differently than the person who'll go through the museum and just not really remember anything? Now there is some evidence for what I just said, by the way. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Interest, of course, counts, but you can ask the question, why are some people interested in something and other people are not? So, and interest alone doesn't do it. Look, I love to watch Nova on television. I fall asleep within 8 minutes almost every night. My wife doesn't like Nova. She wakes me up. She's not that interested, but she's watching and I'm sleeping. So it's complicated. And, of course, age has a big effect on this. I'm just making a simple point that I think there are individual differences in consciousness, and if we could measure those as reliably as we measure individual differences in intelligence, I believe those two measures would be highly correlated.
I think that the line of thought you mentioned is one that is crying out for a distinction between different senses of the word conscious and different notions of consciousness. Now, if by consciousness we mean self-consciousness, I see no reason to think that those two kids you described differ in self-consciousness. I see no reason to think that the kid who absorbs less information is any less aware of himself or something like that. If what you're talking about is experience, like the vividness of experience, I see no reason to believe that those two kids differ in the vividness of their visual experience. They're both looking at paintings. One of them is paying attention, the other one isn't. But they might be, you could take a hippocampal patient like the famous H.M., who when you get back, so this is a guy who had his hippocampus destroyed many years ago, and he still, if you ask him where the bathroom is in his apartment, he tells you where it was before his operation. So if he was in that museum, and you came back and you said, well, what did you see in the museum? He'd say, what museum? But there's no reason to think that his experience would be any less vivid than anybody else's.
Well, here's an experiment.
So here's what we have to get to what we mean by consciousness. It sounds to me like what you're really talking about is some conglomeration of attention and interest, not anything I would call consciousness.
We did an experiment. I'll just go very quickly and then I'll be quiet. We did an experiment where we showed people videos. Very, very boring videos. Okay? And then we showed, well, I'll just keep it simple. We showed boring videos, and we did brain imaging while they watched the video. They were told, just watch the video. You don't have to remember anything. You don't have to say anything. Just watch the video. We tested the subjects on their IQ independently. People with the high IQ had a lot of brain activation in a particular part of the brain while they're watching boring videos, compared to the average IQ people. What part of the brain was it? Was it the frontal lobe? No. Hippocampus? No. It was the early visual processing areas of the brain. So smart people, while they were watching very boring movies, had more activation in early visual processing. I think smart brains work differently. And I think it works differently, not just in the frontal lobes that we're all like to talk about with intelligence, but at very early stage of processing. So the answer to your question is, this is an empirical question, suppose a person has twice the number of neurons in their visual processing area than another person, and the two walk through the museum. And at the end of the day, will it be the person with twice the neurons in their visual processing area that has a richer experience in some way?
You can have that early vision knocked out in time.
They're twice as conscious?
I'm sorry, what?
Are you saying they're twice as conscious?
I'm saying that's an empirical question. Can one person be twice as conscious as another? You can be twice as intelligent as someone. Can you be twice as conscious?
Or 3 times as conscious?
In California, I'd stick to 2 times.
You know, these patients that have a lot of their early visual cortex knocked out do not seem to be any less intelligent than other people.
You can say that about any part of the cortex that's knocked out.
No. And there are some parts of the cortex that can be knocked out and it can really have an effect. You know, frontal parts are knocked out, it can have a really big effect.
People with frontal lobotomies typically don't have a decrease in IQ.
That says something about IQ. That says something about the IQ.
Frontal lobotomy is a pretty drastic manipulation of the brain. Pretty drastic.
What is interesting in the informational approach to self is that because you put the location practically of consciousness or mind, and not in the energetic flow as such, but the information flow. It is interesting. For instance, now me and this computer are 2 different energetic system. That is, he has his source of energy, I am my source of energy. So we are 2 different physical systems. Nevertheless, because we communicate, we exchange information, we want one only information system. Is the famous network, no? One only information system. So, according to information approach to the self, is not the mind in the brain, but the brain in the mind. That is, the mind is located in the continuous information exchange between brain and the rest of the body, and between the brain, the body, and the rest of the universe, the environment. And in this sense, it becomes a little more easy. The approach, always in this time, this number of time, it is remember the hard and the simple problem of consciousness of Chalmers. That is the problem of consciousness, the problem of self-awareness. And the problem of self-awareness means that I consider myself in some sense as a wall. Even though I cannot see my body. Okay, it's a classical no-positivistic evidence. What is the self? Is my body, because it's the only body that I cannot observe completely. Okay? And so, nevertheless, the notion of self-awareness with respect to consciousness are this typical, that self-awareness means that I consider myself as a whole, in some sense. Even though I cannot objectify myself as I read it as an object. And it is interesting that if you consider the mind as something containing the body, and so when, for instance, we dialogue, okay, our minds are between us, okay, it becomes very, very, also some classical evolutionary psychology evidence that the recognition of my I, myself, my I, okay, depends on the relationship with my mother, with the other. No, only by the relation with the other I can discover myself. Okay, classical personality, all disturbed personality are disturbed of relationship with the world or with the other, and from which also the disturb with the relationship with myself derives. And in this approach, all becomes more easy to understand, because instead of putting the mind in the brain, because probably you don't remember that to put the mind in the brain is something related with Plato, that it was Plato who is a dualistic, that is, for him the mind is something completely different from body, who put the mind in the body. And unfortunately, also the people who doesn't believe in a dualistic approach, like I think all of us, we remain with this presupposition to put the mind in the body. On the contrary, is the mind that contains the body. And in this sense, the distinction between consciousness, that is something related directly with the experience inside the body, and the self-awareness, that is something related with the relationship with something outside the body, before all, other person, becomes more easily understandable, according to me. This is only a suggestion. Nevertheless, sorry for the last time, the last question he made, because the notion of information creation, also related with the problem of intelligence, is in all the people. I have here the quotation of Freeman, but also all of us know famous book of Penrose, Roger Penrose. Okay, Shadow of Mind. And you know also the idea of Penrose that intelligence is related with the quantum dynamics inside the brain. But if you read this, why? Because quantum dynamics, like chaotic dynamics, is a classic non-Newtonian dynamic system in which there is a generation of information. So, because every physicist, and the approach of every physicist to the problem of intelligence, of life, of self-organization, is related with the generation of information, classical physical system who display this property in the nature are chaotic, nonlinear, unstable system, and quantum dynamic system. So that I think that this must be considered when we discuss about these topics. And yes, okay, please.
So I just wanted to understand, are you saying it simply put then that we have a self because we so decide to have a self, and we are conscious because we've sort of given it a name, therefore we are conscious?
No, because if my information flow cannot be outside myself in some sense, through the relationship with another person.
Yes.
For instance, when I explain to my students, I say, okay, if you have a child in the what is in Italian, in English, in the incubatrice, that is
A crib?
Incubus, sorry. Why it is necessary that the mother must interact continuously with this child, and it is not sufficient the tubes by which I support its metabolism? Because humans don't live of only matter, but of matter information. That is, human systems, but generally any any organism, any animal, is not only open system from the standpoint of energetic exchange, metabolism, but also the information exchange. They are not the same. The problem of recovering people from coma. Why? If I interact with some information that is able to stimulate his emotional deep state, okay? Why? Because it's information that I have to exchange with him.
Identifying the point you made, which is that the mind is not in the brain?
No, it's the mind included the brain. Mind including my body. That is, mind is a if is information. Information is a relation. Is an ordering relation. Another evidence that is not an evidence, but it can help, quoted by Piers. Each of us change completely the matter of his body. At least twice every year. Twice. Nevertheless, we are the same. Why? Because the ordering of the part, of the material part of the body is the same. So that our continuity in time is not related with matter. It's related with matter and form. Pay attention. The physicists today, like for instance Salinger, Barrow, and so on, say that the physics, the modern physics, till the last century, was essentially physics of energy. The new physics, the physics more interesting today for the theoretical physicists, is the physics of information. What is? Because information is not spirit, okay? It's physics, but it's not matter.
But without the mind, without the body, there's no mind. How can there be a mind if there's no body?
Yes.
It is within whoever it is, but you need the body to have the mind.
Yes, absolutely. Because my person, myself, is not my mind. Myself is my body. But my body is not only matter. It's matter and information. It's matter and information. And matter means mass energy. You remember E equal mc square, okay? That is, I can change mass in energy, energy mass, so that matter, okay, is energy and mass, okay? But in physics, beside energy and mass, there is also information. Information is quantitative, I can measure.
Professor Basti, a point based upon something that Professor LeDoux made about the fact that the nature-nurture equation is really carried out through synaptic development. Mm-hmm. And my question then is, how do you factor the synaptic development physiologically into your concept of the processing and the development of information mm-hmm. and its use to, in effect, create the consciousness?
Yes, according to me, consciousness means I can understand consciousness from the energetic standpoint only as self-control. Self-control, okay? So it's circuitry with the self-injection, okay? And we have a lot of experience in the brain. So what is nice in synapses? Because when I, as a physicist, try to simulate by neural nets, okay, a real neural net in the brain, my simulation is only a rough approximation. Why? Because I am constrained for the limitation of actual mathematics, okay, to simulate in neural nets with fixed thresholds. Okay, that is, I simulate the statistical elements, okay, with different weight, statistical weight, but the threshold must be fixed. Otherwise, there is no possibility with our actual statistical mechanics to study the stable point of these dynamics. What is interesting in brain is that the continuous change of the synapses means that this neural net is with a continuous change of thresholding. And if I simulate this, I obtain a chaotic dynamics. A chaotic dynamics. So that there is a lot of literature about this. Huh?
And again, my question has something to do with whether or not there is something beyond the physiology that, again, Professor LeDoux described in terms of the processing and transmission of information.
Yes, for instance, the evidence, sorry, what is the name?
Richard.
The evidence shown by him that is the attention, the consciousness is related with a very integrating activity in the brain. Okay, in my model, okay, my approach, is also Freeman, also the people who deal with this problem from the chaotic standpoint approach, is related with the richness of the pseudo periods of the chaotic dynamics. That is, more is complex. That is the ability of integrating the system. And more, what I observe with my test on the brain is an integrated dynamics. It means that this cycle, because are always cycle, okay, circuitry, okay, this cycle is a way higher order. Okay, that is with many waves, okay, many maximum and minimum points, okay, very complex, and this is typical of chaotic dynamics. Unfortunately, because often when we speak about chaotic dynamics, what is the chaotic dynamics, and which is the relationship with the Newtonian dynamics, classical linear dynamics. Classical linear dynamics are one only stable point, okay, the minimum of energy. Okay, when you see in all the Museum of Science for Children, you put many balls in a recipient, and then you move, and then you ask to the children where, after some time, all the balls are in the bottom of this recipient. No? This is chaotic dynamics. One only fixed point. Okay, so if I make so. Sorry, and then I hope that, okay, if I make so, okay, how many fixed points I obtain?
This is what Frank Gehry does to design buildings. About the unconscious.
Yes, pay attention. Also the brain, inside physically, the brain in my scalp, here, in my head, is as this form. Okay? Why? Because in this way, I put, and of course the chaotic dynamic means that I continuously change and so I enrich enormously the fixed point, because if I suppose that in each fixed point there is a bit of information, okay? How many I may put here? Understand?
Open it up to questions? That's very good.
Can I ask you a question? So on your point of view, what consciousness is just what you get when you have a self-controlling, nonlinear dynamic system. Is that what your view is?
Yes, it's something related with this from the physical standpoint.
Isn't the stomach a nonlinear dynamic system?
Yes, but pay attention.
So
what is the difference? Yes, because the stomach is not related with the whole nervous system.
But wait a moment. So what is consciousness? I thought your view was consciousness is what you get when you have a nonlinear dynamic system that's self-controlling. But you've conceded that the stomach is such a system.
Okay,
We should actually probably include more people.
I had in the brain, not in the stomach, but in the brain. Or better, in the nervous, in the central nervous system, CNS. Okay.
Yes, indeed.
When we have chaotic dynamics in CNS, and CNS is a system that biology constructed exactly for having the more complex chaotic dynamics that we can imagine in the world, in the universe. Okay.
So the stomach isn't complex enough. So we need a very complex nonlinear dynamic system.
No, but the stomach doesn't control. My leg.
We may want to include other people.
Okay, yeah. I have a question. The early part of this interesting discussion seemed to focus on more of the classical sort of mind-body gap, mind-body problem.
Yes.
And you raised a very interesting path towards some kind of solution, which we call the explanation gap, the explanatory gap. It reminded me very much, not going all the way back to Plato, but to Spinoza, who looked at the universe and was able to understand it in two very different ways, but it was the same thing. So we don't have to look under it under the aspect of mind and corporeal objects. Now, when I'm going to, and then you said that your colleague, Tom Nagel, has done work in this area. I understand if we take that approach that we want to look at this mind-body problem as in a spinocistic way. The kinds of things that all of you were investigating beyond my knowledge, the physicalistic connections. But what kinds of questions would you investigate under the other aspect, the mentalistic? If you take the view that these are two views of the same thing, what would you want to investigate under the other side of the ledger?
Look, I think one thing is to try to distinguish between different concepts of consciousness and other aspects of the mind. One thing that's very helpful in doing that is some of these wonderful thought experiments that philosophers have come up with. Like the inverted spectrum thought experiment, or there's a whole bunch of them. So I think that is, but I think mainly it's making distinctions about what's involved in the mind. I think if you just use ordinary terms without trying to distinguish different ways that they're used, I think you get nowhere, because there have been many episodes in the history of science where people have used these very, commonsensical, ordinary terms, and then it turns out later that they have to be resolved into different concepts. So just to take one example, Aristotle famously used an idea that we translate with the notion of English word speed or velocity, but he didn't distinguish between instantaneous velocity and average velocity. And if you look at his writings, you see that if you make that distinction, a lot of the things he said were wrong. In the 17th century, the first people to scientifically study temperature, or rather to study heat phenomena, didn't distinguish between what we in English call temperature and heat. So temperature and heat are really quite different things. So you can have two items that have the same temperature but contain different amounts of heat because they have different heat capacities, what's called heat capacities. And so they went very wrong because they just used this vague ordinary idea that people had that's now translated as degree of heat. Similarly, I think we need to make some, use thought experiments to make distinctions among different
in all those examples,
ideas.
The philosophical progress on distinction really came from empirical observations, not from kind of untestable thought experiments.
Actually, I think it's a combination of both. So they made a lot of observations, but they didn't know. So here's an example. They would make preparations, these 17th century people in Florence they first did this because they were the first people to do this because they had the glass blowing technology to make these amazing thermometers. So they would make preparations to which they would say, this one has greater degree of heat than this one has greater than this. And they had different tests. Doing experiments, they had tests. So one test was, would it melt paraffin? If it had more degree of heat, it would melt paraffin. Another test was, how much, trying to get more quantitative, how much ice would a certain hot thing melt? Now, we now know those tests measure different things. In order to melt paraffin, it has to have a high temperature above the melting point of paraffin. In order to melt a lot of ice, it has to have a large heat capacity. Even something with a low temperature could melt, not very low, but above 32, but a lot of heat capacity. Something at 40 degrees with a lot of heat capacity could melt a lot of ice. So experiments are no good without the theoretical and conceptual structures. And it's really, I think, a combination. The philosopher Pat Churchland uses the term coevolution. These different levels have to evolve together. You only get progress by combining different theoretical levels and different conceptual levels.
The real difficulty with your question is we don't really know how to make testable or observable observable observations on the mental part.
On the mental part.
Brain imaging is easy. You know, we can do brain imaging all day long. You know, somebody once said if
philosophical discussion wouldn't do.
yeah, but somebody once said if schizophrenia turns out to be a twisted molecule, and we develop a drug to untwist the molecule, you still have to ask the patient if they feel better. And, you know, we can do brain imaging, we can see what parts of the brain are involved, or the circuitry and so on, but as many, many people have pointed out, that doesn't necessarily get us closer to understanding the essence of awareness or conscious experience. And it may be it's like gravity. Gravity is something that we can study. We know it's a property of matter, but we don't have a clue what about matter produces gravity. Well, we know the mind has something to do with the brain. We actually know a lot about the brain, but what the mind is we don't really have the concepts yet. It might be like
Is it a proper study for a scientist?
Yeah, it's the study of psychology. That's what psychology is.
As opposed to an improper study, or no study at all.
But if there's no possibility of arriving at the concept of mind or self or consciousness, then presumably you can't test it, you can't run experiments, you can't empirically do anything with it. You better leave it to the right.
There are lots of parts of it we can study, though.
I think that's the answer.
Right.
But without knowing how that part
Well, we may never
fits in or is included.
Even if we never understand consciousness, we can help people quite a bit with their problems by understanding some of the parts.
Well, that's...
I mean, we can certainly try towards...
You know, my answer to that is we have people who study what happened in the first 5 milliseconds of the Big Bang. You know, if they can do that, we can study consciousness.
I was wondering if you could get back to sort of how emotionality dictates consciousness. Just think of your example of the kid in the museum. I can picture a depressed kid not being able to be so conscious of the environment. I was wondering if you could
You might know more about I mean, the emotions can influence every aspect of brain function. So I think what we're talking about here, we're assuming kind of a normal functioning brain. But even within the normal functioning brain, I think you can still ask the question, are there individual differences in conscious awareness?
Well, in that particular experiment, you might wonder what the kid was thinking about when he wasn't looking through the museum. He might have been more attentive just to...
He might have been doing thought experiments about...
I think the program is called The Mystery of the Mind. And if I follow the trajectory of the discussion, we began with the explanatory gap, and then we really don't know anything about consciousness. I mean, nobody has yet seemed to have hypothesized or theorized or whatever an acceptable explanation for consciousness. And so what the discussion in one part has been about is, as he says, the aspects that can be studied, and pointing to the fact that throughout the history of science, the methodology is also a limitation as well as an opportunity. Right? So you're functioning within that framework. The point seems to be that the frameworks that you're functioning within leave us where we began, which is with the mystery of the mind. And so can we posit a question of the possibility of building any kind of bridge, even if it's a theoretical one and against the grain of experimental scientists, that might close the gap? And I think you were suggesting something of that history of physics and the chaotic theory of non-linear, etc., as an alternative approach, or as a possible bridge of understanding.
Well, you know, Ned hasn't really fully explained his theory, but he's got a very elaborate theory of consciousness, and some of his other colleagues have theories as well that are, I think, advancing the field. Whether they're right or not, I think you'd be willing to admit maybe you're right, maybe not. But I think there's been a lot of progress in the conceptual. I just haven't really talked about that.
I think there's been a lot of progress too. I think one has to watch out for a certain, a mistake. I think that Francis Crick is very well spelled out, which is the temptation to think that if you're going to try to explain something mysterious like consciousness. You've just got to use something else mysterious, like quantum mechanics or chaos, to explain it. It's not clear you're going to get anywhere that way. I actually think the regular, neuroscientific approaches are making advances. It's true that the explanatory gap hasn't been closed, but that doesn't mean we're not any closer to closing it.
Did you say earlier we were...
Mysticism is an alternative. When you're suggesting that, I think it's great to think that it's always somebody's alternative.
Did you say earlier that we were at pre-Socratic level, scientifically speaking?
No, I think we're a little bit ahead of that. Maybe it's Socratic.
No, but probably a gap, the gap remains a gap because consciousness as such is absolutely subjective and cannot be objectified in any way. So it is impossible to reduce consciousness to everything else. But a gap, an help for jumping the gap is precisely to locate consciousness or mind in information, because information is related also in computer with a classical capability of mind related with also a mentalistic approach, that is rationality, reasoning. Okay, but Husserl, for instance, I quote Husserl, distinguished, recovering a very old distinction, because I quote also the scholastic Middle Age philosophy, but I quote Husserl, that is modern. The distinction between thinking and thought. That is, thought what means? It is reasoning. That is, I reason on symbols already given, exactly like computer. A computer need to be programmed, so that I have to give it the symbols of its calculation, otherwise it cannot calculate at all. But human intelligence, creative intelligence, is related with not the thought, ratio in ancient Latin, but with intellect. Intellect in ancient Latin means thinking, that is, to invent new symbols, to invent a new logic, to invent a new theorem. Okay, this invention that generally is explained is not explained because it seems casual. Okay, I sleep and I dream and I invent. No, it's not true, because any person working knows that for inventing a new theory, he must learn it, must study a lot. So it's not casuality. Okay. Thinking is related with the ability of a system of redefine the basic symbols of its calculation, inventing a new geometry, inventing a new formal system. And so, I repeat, and I don't want to repeat myself, but is related with generation of information. And so, I think this is not to solve the gap. Okay, but to put the solution of the gap that for me it will remain forever, because it's something that cannot be reduced at all. I can quote also the different logical theorems that demonstrate this, but I don't want this also because there is a lot of bibliography on this. Okay.
Any other questions?
And so sorry, is the information manipulation, generation, the real point in which the gap between mentalistic and the neurophysiological approach can be solved or can be treated.
I have a question for Dr. Heyer and Dr. LeDoux. If you had unlimited funding from the NIH, what's your most burning question that you're going to answer about consciousness in the next 5 years?
There's a practical question. Thank you.
Well, I don't study consciousness, so I wouldn't be able to use the money.
I would focus on the mechanism of anesthetic drugs and how they turn consciousness off and how consciousness reappears when the effects of those drugs stop. I think if we know something about the mechanism of unconsciousness to the point where we can manipulate it fairly successfully, I think from that we'll have some data to hone our ideas about consciousness.
I would want to study more about how, as I started to say a while ago, how multiple systems interact during complex things like an emotional episode, how memories are being laid down simultaneously in multiple systems, and in fact, whether there is a different code in these different structures that prevents them being talking to one another. But.
I'm sorry. Early in the discussion, you referred to emotional reactions on the part of rats in experiments. And I became quite puzzled because that's an extraordinary use of the term emotion. And so I wonder what you
Sure.
what you use the term emotional.
So as Ned pointed out, our common language terms often get us in trouble when we do science. And so I started out doing rat research to study emotion in the sense that you probably mean. But I quickly realized that what I was doing was studying something very different. I was studying how, in the case of fear, which is what I study, what I'm looking at is how the brain detects danger and responds to danger. And this is a fundamental system that is in the nervous system of every living creature. A bacteria in a petri dish will move to the other side if you squirt acid in there. People in a swimming pool move to the other side if you throw acid in. So the question is, or get out.
Small difference between the two.
How are these systems operating, and what's common? I mean, obviously that's that's too big a distinction, but within rats and people, there are fundamental systems that work basically the same. So we can do an experiment in the rat using Pavlovian conditioning, very simple, and have the rat develop a phobia to a stimulus. We can do the same thing in a person. We can take out the amygdala in the rat, and the rat won't learn this response. We can study people who have amygdala damage, and they can't learn it. We can record activity in the cells of rats, and the amygdala changes. In the human brain, we can do functional imaging, and the amygdala changes during this kind of learning. So what we're looking at is how the brain, whether it's a rat or a human, detects and responds to danger. Now, when you take that ability to detect and respond to danger and put it into a brain that can be conscious of its own activities, then you have fear in the sense of emotion, which is, I think, what you were talking about. So I'm not really studying emotion in the traditional sense of the term. In fact, I think the only way we've made any progress in studying emotion is by ignoring the conscious aspects of emotion.
The Pavlovian response and the fear response seem to be responses to very simple states of emotion. And so I guess the question I have to you is, in the more complex states of
PTSD?
Crises of spirit,
right.
Is there any kind of parallel, or is that?
Well, when you do brain research, it really helps if you have a stimulus and a response. It's very easy to study the brain in that way. So that's what we do. To study depression is very hard because you can't turn it on and turn it off. You don't know where to start and where to stop. With the stimulus, you go into the ear. You trace it through the ear into blah, blah, blah. Ultimately, you get to the amygdala. The amygdala then connects up with the systems that control the responses. You got to have a stimulus and a response to make progress. It's a sad state of where we are in science, but at least we've been able to do that. But it's not that it's irrelevant to humans, because the PTSD victim who's having a terrible anxiety reaction to a backfiring car is exhibiting one of these kinds of Pavlovian conditioned responses. I mean, all of our associations to emotional stimuli is Pavlovian conditioning. I mean, it may sound like a kind of trivial term for all of this, but our reactions to a stimulus because of some bad thing that happened in association with that stimulus is simply Pavlovian conditioning.
I don't mean to be critical of anybody in terms of my previous comments. I think you did exactly what you were here to do, to bring your discipline and your perspective. So it seems to me it would be fascinating, since the theme is mystery of the mind, to have an additional panel of people who bring other perspectives to that question. that are beyond your disciplines.
This is the third or fourth in this series already, so I think you can count on others.
Oh, that's fabulous. Yeah. Because if we think of self as a distributed self instead of only a body-centered self, then the linguist,
it's not a small
speaking of language, might give us another dimension about self in terms of that, or the loyalty that brings one to sacrifice their life. Where does that come from? There's a whole host of possible bridges to that fascinating question.
Can I just second that?
Okay.
That it seems to me that you've all been discussing everything with the use of words, right? Well, had you questioned what the function of your language was, we would have gone back to Freud. And then the psychoanalysts would have had a heyday because Freud had explanatory principles for most of the things that have been discussed, and they actually work. And so it would have been interesting to integrate them, and also a semiotician would have been helpful because the relationship between form and content has to do with the form of the information, right? But it's very relevant to what you're saying.
Thank you all. Terrific.